Noel, welcome to the show, mate.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good to see you. As we saw, I mean, Tina Turner, an absolute icon. There are no other words.
Yeah.
Favourite Tina Turner track?
River Deep, Mountain High.
Yeah.
I guess.
What about you?
The best. Do you know what? I would actually say the same.
Nah, see,
It's classic.
Simply the best, all the way.
Yeah, 80s girl.
80s girl.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that video and that period of her life's iconic, though, isn't it?
It's all of it is so incredible, and there will be a special evening of programmes in tribute to Tina and her music this Saturday from 9:10 on BBC Two, and you can catch Tina Turner at the BBC and When Tina Turner Came to Britain on iPlayer right now.
Yeah, right, OK. We're going to be talking about your new music shortly. But first, another one of your passions. We know you love football.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Why did you have to bring this up?
I know, but it's awkward, but we have to go
yes,
there.
Noel, I am an Arsenal fan. Yes, it was very tough. Congratulations.
Not from where I was sitting, it wasn't.
No. Right, anyway, look, if winning the league on Sunday wasn't enough for Manchester City, the club was also busy trialling something incredible, new equipment that could mean blind supporters can appreciate the match from the stands.
Amal Latif was given exclusive access to try the tech while soaking up the triumphant atmosphere. I know it hurts.
For many football fans, there's nothing like the atmosphere in the stands. As a blind person, I've never actually been to a match at a football stadium before because I just didn't think that I'd get anything from it. But here at Manchester City, Sunday's match against Chelsea wasn't just momentous for their league win. It also saw an exciting trial of a touchpad that helps blind and visually impaired people experience the beautiful game in a new way. Like me, diehard fan Jason has retinitis pigmentosa, and he's been coming to support Man City with friends and family since he was a child.
I'm virtually blind in my right eye, and my left eye is my good eye, and it's like looking through frosted glass.
How do you manage?
Well, usually my friend tells what's going on, and I go for a lot of the crowd reaction as well.
So as a blind person, what do you get out of it?
Well, it's like you feel part of a family. The atmosphere is always really, really good.
Audio description commentary has been available in many stadiums for years, but it doesn't suit everyone because it drowns out the atmosphere. So inventor Omar Salim created Field of Vision, a new system to help blind fans follow the action. So Omar, how does this work?
There's a magnetic ring,
Right.
which will move around the tactile pitch wherever the ball goes.
There are different vibrations to signal the ball going out of bounds, a free kick, and a goal. Oh! It buzzes! So, Omar, how did you come up with this idea?
Steve came across a video online of blind football fans with a friend or family member just narrating the game to them or tracing the ball position kind of on the palm of their hand. Thought, why is it being done without technology? Started building prototypes in my bedroom.
This is Jason's third time using the system. So you're like a veteran. So
Yes.
do you feel pretty confident that you know what's going on?
Yeah, I do now, yeah. I feel like a lot more part of it now.
We've also invited along visually impaired fan Maria Hafiz. She's loved football since she was a child, but has never been to a stadium match.
I couldn't really see the players exactly. I could sort of map out where they were. I couldn't really see the ball.
Maria and I just have time to get up to speed on how it all works. And then it's kick-off. Chelsea's got the ball. And pretty soon the pad is telling us what's happening. Is that a tackle?
Yeah.
Oh, that feels nice.
But you could actually feel when the goal went in. I think the whole tablet sort of shook itself.
After the thrill of the early goal, Man City are 1-0 up at half-time. The pad will shortly be rolled out in Australia for Aussie rules football fans, and Omar hopes it'll soon be widely available here. For us, it's been a revelation.
So Jason, we're coming to the end of the game. How do you feel?
Fantastic, brilliant. Usually like, you just go off the crowd reaction, but now you feel like you're more involved with it because you know what's happening on the pitch.
At full-time, Man City had won, the fans were over the blue moon, and so was I.
The system's so simple, yet it allows me to follow the match in a way that I didn't think possible. Being here
inside the stadium, whilst having all the atmosphere around me, it's absolutely incredible.
Oh, that is such a brilliant idea, isn't it?
It is fantastic.
So
really
good.
is.
Now, interestingly, Noel wasn't there on Sunday to see this victory.
No.
What happened?
Well, we gamed it out that we'd probably win it last night, or was it last night? Yeah, or Sunday against Brighton, but we weren't expecting this lot to give it to us.
OK, so let's talk about the album, shall we? Now, the cover of the new album obviously pays homage to the club's former home and Main Road, right?
Yeah.
Special place for a lot of Manchester City fans, and to you, clearly. I mean, you played there back in 1996.
Yeah.
I mean, what are your memories of this gig? It looks incredible.
It was the first stadium we'd ever done, and of course it was the stadium where we grew up watching football. It's about a 5-minute walk from where I was born. And, you know, it just started that run of stadiums we'd done. Then we just did stadiums forevermore. And it was, you know, we weren't even that nervous doing it. We were kind of, you know, like with the power of youth and all that. And it was just an amazing time to, you know, 96 was I thought it was 94, but anyway, 96. It was crazy times, great times to be, you know, of a certain age, and the Britpop thing and all that was amazing.
And stepping out at your home ground must have been a moment.
Well, yeah, because I'd stood on the terraces on the Kippax and, you know, sang, you know, when you've got 30,000 people singing these songs. I often wonder if that was where my love of an anthem came from. But it was amazing. It's still amazing now when I think of it, you know.
So great. And the new album, obviously very reflective. Let's take a listen to the title track, Council Skies.
Dedicated to it all, and underneath the council sky I found you. 'Cause life is unpredictable, you can win or lose it all. Underneath the council sky I found
It's It's brilliant. Now, on the album, there's pictures of lots of different locations and places that were significant to you growing up. Just talk us through a few of them, then, that we're seeing here.
Well, that's Longsight Market, where I was born in 1967, and it's still there, still a working market, which is amazing. And that's like a 5-minute walk from Main Road, and still pass it from time to time. And this is the Apollo. Everyone in Manchester knows this. It's the Apollo where I say my first ever gig in 1980 was the Damned, and yeah, there's lots of little significant places like the park where we all used to hang out at the first record, with the top we bought our first records and all that. So
Yeah, it's like, this is my life.
Yeah.
a little bit like that. Yeah.
Now, we've got lots of questions for you, Noel. Jacqueline asks, what's your greatest songwriting achievement?
To be still doing it. I think to still, when you're putting out new records after 30 years and still writing albums, you know, I don't co-write then. I don't have a team of producers or anything. So just the fact that I'm still doing it and still into it, I guess.
That's it. Look, it's such a busy time as well for you. You're playing the US and UK summer dates and arena tour plan for the autumn. And we've had this question from Stuart, who said on Twitter, Noel, what do you enjoy most, creating a new song or playing live at gigs?
Writing. The gig is a final payoff because you get to present it to a crowd and see how it moves them. But actually, there's a place where you go to on your own as an artist, and you just create something from nothing, and you get to decide whether you get to record it. So it's a very personal thing. But I do like recording as well. You know, when you're bringing it to life is amazing. Yeah. But the whole thing is great. Your fellow will tell you that. It's amazing.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I don't know how many of his gigs he can remember, if I'm totally honest. But out of the gigs that you did play, I mean, what were some of your favourites?
Well, the Main Road gigs, Nebworth, of course. We did some amazing gigs in Argentina and Buenos Aires, some of the best fans in the world, and you know, Japanese gigs because it's so alien to kind of your culture. Yeah. But they were all great. Even now, they're all great. It's different now, of course, but it's all been great. You know, the Oasis stuff is iconic, and what I do, and I really enjoy what I do now. I've got. The more I do it, the longer that I've done it, the more I appreciate it now.
Very nice.
And a little bird tells us it's your birthday on Monday.
That's right.
Do you still get a card from your mum?
There'll definitely be some kind of... I think my mum might be the only one that bothers to acknowledge it.
Oh, no, well,
no.
sad times. Sad times with all those fans.
Yeah.
I know. Well, the thing is, you should actually... The thing is I always feel that you should acknowledge it to your mum on your birthday, seeing as she was one that was doing all the hard work.
Yes.
Very true. That's it.
I
That's
like
it.
you even more. Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds album, Council Skies, is out next Friday, the 2nd of June. And, of course, happy birthday, Monday.
Thank you very much.
Still to come, we'll be talking to actors